You are watching Area DMG.
Hello. Oh. Everybody hear me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hi there. Hey, thanks for coming. My name's Warren Davis. I am here to talk about QBERT. QBERT is a game that I designed and programmed in 1982, which makes this the 35th anniversary of QBERT. It's crazy. It came out at the end of the year, so most people think of QBERT as being from 1983, but I actually started developing in 1982. I started working at Gottlieb, the company that made QBERT, in 1982, in January, in fact. But I will talk a little bit about that. Just a little bit about me. QBERT was the first game that I created, and I stayed with Gottlieb until it closed their doors. They closed their doors in 1984. That's a whole story in itself. I might touch on it a little bit later. I then went out of the video game industry for a year and then came back to Williams. And I worked at Williams, where I developed the video digitization system that ended up getting used for all of their games like Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. And I was on the design team for Terminator 2 and Revolution X featuring Aerosmith. I also, my first thing at Williams was programming Joust 2, along with a couple of other people. So I've had a varied career. I stayed in the video game industry, the arcade industry, until about 1995, and then I moved to Disney, where I started making home games for Disney. And then in the 2000s, I just worked on, I worked for a couple of studios on a variety of different projects. And the last job I had was for ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, making previous software for movies. And then I was laid off in 2010. And since then, I've been just a consultant, contractor. I haven't had a regular job for 7 years. So, I love it. All right. So, yeah, today we're going to talk about QBERT and the origins of QBERT. We'll talk a little bit about the history of QBERT, but I'm curious, how do you know QBERT? You know, QBERT, one of the amazing things of over 35 years, the character is still well known and still beloved by some people. Of course, it is completely unknown by some people. It's a very humbling experience, you know, when either I or somebody else says, "Oh, you know, here's the guy who designed QBERT," and they go, "Oh, what's that?" So it happens quite often, and that's fine. You know, there are many ways you might know QBERT, and of course, this is the original arcade game, which is what I designed and programmed. Worked with Jeff Lee, who did the graphic art, and Dave. That's the video graphics, not the cabinet graphics. That was somebody else. And then Dave Field, who did the sounds for the game. So the three of us really are the creators of the game, in my eyes. Then there was QBERT's Cubes. There was the sequel, the arcade sequel, QBERT's Cubes. This was created by a guy named Neil Bernstein. I will talk a little bit about this later. Of course, there were the many home versions of QBERT. This shows a bunch of them here, the cartridges. This is just an ad out of a magazine which shows many of them for all of the systems that were available at that time, 1983. And then you got this little handheld, or QBERT, you know, I don't know, you could still find those like on eBay and stuff like that. But those were available. There was a pinball game, not here at the show, but there was a pinball game called QBERT's Quest, and this is a shot at the play field that was designed by John Trudeau. I mean, this is a pinball show. I'm kind of surprised I was invited to come to a pinball show. I have no pinball experience in my background, other than I will say this: I am the voice of Wet Willie in the pinball game Whitewater. So my pinball cred. Of course, I worked with a lot of pinball guys, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, here's another way you might know QBERT if you're somewhat older. I mean, does anybody remember this? Did anybody see this on TV? No. This is the QBERT cartoon show. It was part of something called the Saturday Morning Supercade. And Qbert was featured. There was also Frogger, Donkey Kong, and some other video game characters on Saturday mornings. This just gives you an idea of how popular Qbert was in its time. And believe me, nobody was more shocked about that than me. There was a little bit of a lull where nothing happened with Qbert. Of course, I moved on to other things, but it was 1992 before there was a Qbert 3. I think they called it Qbert 3 because Qbert's Cubes was technically Qbert 2. Came out for the Super Nintendo, and Jeff Lee worked on that. The artist who did the original Qbert worked on that. I had nothing to do with it. The Qbert for Game Boy came out in 1992 as well. And then the next Qbert came out in 1999. There's an interesting story about Qbert because I was hired in 1982, January of 1982, to make video games for Gottlieb. And when you are hired in a capacity like that, you sign a little piece of paper that says everything you create is owned by the company. So I did not own the rights to Qbert, I never have. But after Gottlieb folded, I moved on to Williams, I moved on to other things. And then I was working at Disney in the late 90s, and I went to a trade show, the Game Developers Conference in San Jose, and I was always curious about what happened to the rights to Qbert, because in the mid-90s, I became aware of the earliest retro gaming nostalgia movement. That's what people started to get nostalgic about old video games. I mean, for 10 or 15 years, nobody had thought about them. I certainly hadn't. But I was starting, people were starting to contact me and talk about, those old video game days. So I was curious about who owned the rights to Qbert. Of course, now you may not know this, but Gottlieb, for many years, a family-owned pinball company. In 1977, they were purchased or sold to Columbia Pictures. So when I was working for Gottlieb, they were owned by Columbia Pictures. Columbia Pictures was bought by Coca-Cola. So we had this mega giant Coca-Cola who really were, over us. And they did not want to have a pinball company in their portfolio, and that is why Gottlieb closed its doors in 1984. It's not because it was failing financially. And then Coca-Cola got out of the picture, and Sony bought Columbia Pictures. And so technically the rights to Qbert went to Columbia, and then Columbia was bought by Sony. So Sony should have owned the rights to Qbert, and I was pretty sure that they did. So I went to this Game Developers Conference, and the people from Sony, SCEA, Sony Computer Entertainment, whatever it was called, they were there. They had a little booth, and I went up to them and I said, why aren't you doing anything with Qbert? There's this big retro gaming thing, and they were like, what are you talking about? I said, well, you guys own the rights to Qbert. And they were like, we do? So I was the one who told Sony that they owned the rights to Qbert. And literally a year later, this came out for the PlayStation, Dreamcast, and PC. It was a new Qbert from Hasbro Interactive. I had nothing to do with it. I did talk to some of these Hasbro Interactive people at a trade show once, and I said, I'm happy to consult with you. I've always had ideas for what to do with the character that no one's ever even attempted, and they said, oh, that's great, we'd love to pick your brain, and we can't pay you. Oh, well, thanks anyway. So, and of course, most recently, Qbert has enjoyed some new success in these two movies, Wreck-It Ralph up here, and Pixels down there on the bottom. And Wreck-It Ralph, I think everybody loved Wreck-It Ralph, thought it was a great movie. Pixels, maybe mixed reviews. But whatever, the character was brought back. I will say I'm a little disappointed that over the years, his nose has become more and more flaccid. I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know why people are doing that, but I have nothing to do artistically. And then the latest Qbert, they just came out with a recent version. Qbert Rebooted was for the PS4, for the Xbox One. You can get it on Steam. And he is more flaccid here than in any of these other pictures. I don't know what is going on. I don't know if he's showing his age or what, but man, they got to rejuvenate that guy. Again, I'm going to talk more about my history with Qbert and the original development of it. And the question is, how do you get a job making video games in 1982? I had a master's degree in electrical engineering. My undergrad was in computer and systems engineering. And video games came out in the early 1970s. I was in college when the first arcade games were introduced, and I was thoroughly taken by them. As a guy who was studying computers at the time, I was amazed at these machines. I guess my whole interest in computers from my earliest childhood was in how they could be used for entertainment. I just thought computers were a great tool for entertainment. And when video games came out, I was like, how do I make these games? And I thought you had to be someone special to make video games. I thought you had to know somebody or just be a genius or something. I literally had no idea how you get in that door. But the way I got in the door was I answered an ad in the paper, in the Chicago Tribune. It just so happened I had been working at Bell Labs, doing a job that took me among many places. My job at Bell Labs took me to Denver. And I lived in Denver for 5 months in 1981. Loved it here, by the way, I don't know. I'm assuming most of you are from this area or living in this area. But I loved it here in 1981. And, but I was kind of getting tired of being sent on assignment for months at a time, and I wanted to do something different. And I quit my job in suburban Illinois, moved into Chicago, and was unemployed for a few months. And I started, you know, and actually I was so disillusioned with my engineering job. I was thinking, I'm not going to be an engineer anymore. And yet, and I tried a number of odd jobs, but on weekends, the Sunday paper would come out, and I would kind of look at the engineering want ads just to see what was there, you know. And one Sunday, it was actually December 27th, 1981. This is the actual ad. I actually dug it up on the Chicago Tribune archives. I saw this ad, looking for hardware, software engineers to make video games. Now, and I was stunned. I could not believe that somebody was just looking just for anybody to walk in. So this was December 27th. It was between Christmas and New Year's. I was single. I was kind of living by myself. Well, I had a roommate, but I had no family where I was living. All my family was back east. And you know, I sent in a resume and a letter immediately. It was very informal. Like I didn't try to make it too professional, because I thought, you know what, if they don't like me the way I am. You know, one of the things I didn't like about Bell Labs, it was a very professional, sort of stuck-up kind of environment, and I was looking for something looser, and I thought, all right, I'm just going to be me. So I sent it in, and I got an interview scheduled almost immediately. I felt like it was like immediate, 2 days later. I got a letter scheduling me for an interview, and I went in right after New Year's for an interview. Here's the location. This is actually a picture of the place where I interviewed, where I started working. This is 759 Industrial Drive. This is the way it looks like 2 years ago. So it's another company right now. It wasn't blue. I kind of remember it being just all sort of gray. But I drove up to this place. This place is in suburban Chicago, like on the other side of O'Hare, if you know the Chicago area. It's like right behind O'Hare, in an industrial park. And I drove in, and as I'm walking into the front door, this sort of like very heavy-set, gruff kind of guy is walking in the opposite direction. He goes, "You here for an interview?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Yeah." What? He says, "Watch out for that Waxman guy. He's a real dick." So I go, oh, okay. So I went in, and I meet sort of a middle manager guy named Bill Jacobs, and he gives me a tour, and I meet all the guys that are working there, and you know, some of them seem really cool, and it is a very sort of loose, kind of cool environment. Nobody's wearing a tie. A couple of these guys struck me as being very engineering types, and you know, I was trying to get away from those guys who were like real heavy, you know, just people who talk in acronyms, because I always spoke in English, and I never liked talking in jargon. But anyway, eventually I had an interview with the vice president of engineering. His name's Ron Waxman. And I go in, and lo and behold, Ron Waxman is the guy who I talked to outside, who told me to watch out for Waxman. And he's got this gruff demeanor. He's really large. He had like a mustache and a little beard, and he would fold his arm. What makes you think you can make video games? You know, and I would say, well, I don't know, because I've never done it. I'd like to, but I don't know. You have a computer at home? No. I use them at work. I don't really. And this is 1982. This is January of 1982, so it's not like a lot of people had computers at home. And I went through this interview with him, and I'm just convinced, you know, he does not like me. I'm just like, I'm not going to get this job. But I did. I did get this job, and this is a photo of Waxman. I'm sorry. I meant to say this is a photograph. No, it's not a photograph, of course. But this is actually a representation of Waxman that was created by Jeff Lee in Pixels, and I'll tell you where this comes from in a second. But I did get hired, and this was my first business card. So you notice the address, 759. The thing about this place is that it was not the main plant. So Gottlieb has been around for years. It's a pinball manufacturer. They only got into the video game industry in 1977, and their first couple of games were licensed from Japan. So they just started, maybe a year and a half before they hired me, they just started an in-house video game department. And they were late in the game. I mean, Williams, Valley, all of the other pinball companies, Stern, were making video games before Gottlieb. So, the department was run by two guys. It was Ron Waxman, and then the VP of Business Development was a guy named Howie Rubin. And Howie and Ron really did, I mean, these guys were heroes. They did an amazing job of protecting this little video department from the rest of the company. So we really didn't know what was going on. We were given carte blanche. They didn't tell us what to do because they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to make a video game. Really, we didn't know how to make a video game. Pretty much nobody at that time knew how to make a video game except maybe Eugene Jarvis, who had already done Defender. But we had a small team, maybe 4 or 5 programmers. Jeff Lee, I think, was the only artist. Other than, well, we had sort of an in-house guru. So one of the first things that Gottlieb did before they, hired the whole staff, or when they had a very small staff, they wanted somebody with a track record who knew what they were doing. So they hired this guy. This is Tim Skelly. I don't know if any of you have heard of Tim Skelly, but Tim Skelly at that time was like a rock star of video game design. He was the designer of Star Castle. He did Rip Off, Armor Attack. He worked for Cinematronics and just had this string of hits. So he was hired to sort of be the mentor to this little fledgling video group. And he's sitting on 3 reactors. That was his first game for Gottlieb, Reactor. And when I was hired, Reactor was just basically finishing up, kind of the end of the cycle. It was about to be going into production. Hadn't gone into production yet. So when I was hired, it was like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? I don't know how to make a video game. So they turned me over to a guy named Tom Malinowski. And Tom Malinowski was working on a game. It was a superhero-themed game based on the movie Superman 2, where Superman battles these 3 Kryptonian villains. That was the inspiration, because we didn't have the rights to Superman, so we couldn't call it Superman. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I have a little clip here. So obviously not Superman in the clip, but he's flying around shooting things, and there's villains. Take a look at the little yellow guy down at the bottom. I just want you to know that's me. That is a representation of me down at the bottom of the screen. So this game was, so basically my job on the game was just some supplemental routines. You saw those buildings on the side. Well, the villains would smash into the buildings, and then rubble would come out and fall on the pedestrians, and as the superhero you had to protect them. My job was to program the rubble. So I programmed the rubble. And then if enough rubble accumulated, then I programmed a bulldozer that came out from the side of the screen and just pushed the rubble away. So that was my involvement in this. And by the way, so this is Jeff Lee's little pixelated drawing of me. And it's really amazing because in however many pixels this is, I don't know, 16 pixels high or something, I mean, he managed to, all those pedestrians had their own personalities. Jeff Lee was really good at what he did. And basically, the way we created art back in those days, we had a tool, a piece of software that was called, well, we had 2 of them, one for the foreground, one for the background. The foreground one was called Focus, Foreground Object Graphic utility system. I don't know, I'm totally guessing what that stood for. It stood for something. So focus, and for background we had bogus. And basically it put up a grid, just a big grid that was like 32 by 32 for foreground, 16 by 16 for background blocks, because that was the size, and you just picked your 16 colors in a palette and plopped them in the grid. And so Jeff would, do things like this, and then literally pixel by pixel create every sprite. Kind of crazy, but that's the way we did it back then. Anyway, so this game, Tom's game, was put out on test, and they called it Protector. It didn't test very well, and they thought, oh, well, maybe the name's weird, so let's call it something else. So they called it Video Man, and they put it back out on test, and it still didn't test very well. And so they said, well, you know what? Maybe, because I think it had a trackball originally, and they said, well, maybe it needs a joystick instead of a trackball. So they replaced it with a joystick and made some changes. Then they called it Guardian. It still didn't test very well. And then I don't know why, but they put it out again with the name Argus. And they kept putting this game out on test with all these different names. It became a joke. And I started calling it Pro VidGuard Argus. To this day, that's what I call it. The sort of irony about this is that they found some ROMs for this recently. Does anybody know who Doc Mack is at Galloping Ghost Arcade in the Chicago area? Doc Mack is a guy who runs the Galloping Ghost Arcade, and Jeff Lee lives just a couple of miles from there, and he's there all the time. And they found these ROMs, and so Tom Malinowski, Jeff Lee, and Doc Mack restored this game. They called it Argus, and it's actually in his arcade. You can go to Chicago and play this game now in the arcade, which is kind of cool. Okay, and this was, oh, I forgot to mention. So remember that picture of Waxman I showed you? Jeff actually created a superhero version of Ron Waxman, and this is an actual marquee that they created to see if we could turn it into a jokey, kind of funny game. And there it is, Waxman, Waxman. Still never got released. It was an unreleased game. But at this point, I had done my part on this game, and it was something like March or April of 1982, and the question for me became, well, now what? My job is to make video games. I sort of got my feet wet with Pro VidGuard Argus, and what do I do? Well, let me talk a little bit about our space. So this space in Bensonville was really kind of a think tank kind of environment. We didn't have offices. We didn't have cubicles. It was basically like some people had offices, but most of us worked in one open room that just had work tables. And we did our development on a thing called, we called it the Blue Box. It was an Intel development system, and it connected to our video game hardware system, but through, an in-circuit emulator thing. And but there weren't enough systems to go around, so we would share systems. And one day I was just walking through the office, and one of our programmers named Kan Yamamoto, if any of you have heard of the game Mad Planets, Kan Yamamoto created Mad Planets. Anyway, he had this pattern up on the screen. Now this is an Escher pattern. It's basically a very small number of background blocks that are repeated, so you can get the sort of infinite thing. And Kan wasn't doing really anything with it. He just had it, he was playing with foreground and background switching. So our hardware allowed you to do that. And so he was actually like putting the foreground behind the background and then removing background blocks to reveal something behind. But when I walked by and I saw it, I mean, I was fascinated by it, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting, because if a ball, let's just say a random ball, were to fall on any one of these, it would have two choices of where to go next, right or left. And I thought, okay, this could be a good exercise, an exercise in randomness. Programming randomness is kind of an important thing in any video game, so I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. And then also gravity, because when I programmed the rubble, there was no gravity to the rubble. It just kind of came out at a constant speed and went down, because even the simplest physics I had never coded. So I thought, all right, let me do something just for my own programming exercise. Program a ball. I got Jeff to draw me a little round ball. Let me have a ball bouncing, and I will program it to bounce randomly. And of course, you can fit 7 rows on a screen, and 7 right and left. That's 1 bit. It's a 1-bit choice. You put 7 bits together, that fits in a byte. So if you get a random byte, you can determine the path of a ball falling down this thing. So in my mind, I envisioned this thing as a pyramid. So a ball would fall at the top and blub, 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 blub. So that's what I did. I went about creating, you know, the right background blocks to give the pyramid an edge, and programmed it. So people looked at it and they thought it was cool. And then it was like, again, what do I do next? Because, you know, I did this and I had it and people thought it was cool. Well, of course, you know, the obvious thing is next to create a player character to start hopping around the pyramid. So I went to Jeff and I said, do you have characters? I just need a player character. And he, you know, Jeff's a very enterprising guy, and he had many game ideas, which unfortunately, you know, because Gottlieb was a programmer-centric shop. So programmers were the project leaders, programmers were the designers, because if a programmer didn't program something, it wasn't going to happen. So, but he had ideas for games, and he had created characters. So he said, yeah, I got a bunch of characters here. So he showed me all these characters, and there was one that was kind of oval shaped with a long nose, and orange and fuzzy, and I was like, yeah, he looked kind of pathetic. And I thought, that's cool, let me use that guy as the player character. So he drew me the angles I needed, because obviously I needed him to face away sometimes. And I went and programmed that guy into the game. I mean, the next thing I had to, so everything that followed pretty much followed logically in the development of this game. I had to have the player character collide with balls, so I had to figure out how to do that. Then I had to have the player character fall off and behind the pyramid, which was, we were able to do because we had this foreground-background switching that the hardware let us do very easily. So Qbert jumps off the pyramid, everything else disappears, we switch foreground and background plane, and now when he falls, it looks like he's falling behind the pyramid. So I was just having fun. I was just throwing things in there as I needed. But it still was not a game. It was a guy jumping around, but you had no goal. So I was playing around with it one night. I tended to work late at night. I liked my job, and I was hanging out late. And Ron Waxman also liked to stay late. And he also liked to come into the room where we worked and just kind of like sit behind us and watch us work. Yeah, it's very creepy. And he smoked a cigar. He almost always had a cigar with him. And you could hear him breathing like Darth Vader sitting behind him. You know, and one night I'm just sitting there, I'm just playing around with my game, just trying to see what I can do. And he's just, I just hear this voice behind me go, "What if the cubes change color when he lands on them?" And I was like, yes. I was like, that's brilliant, yes. So I took it. That was the next thing I did, have the tops of the cubes change color. So now it's a game. Now it's a game. You have a goal. You have to finish it up. So I continued to program away, and you know, everything really just sort of followed logically, right? You needed somebody chasing after Qbert. So Jeff created this coily character, and I programmed it to be the villain chasing Qbert, jumping off the pyramid. You know, the discs was the way that you can kill the enemy. So all these things just seemed very much logical. Ugh and Wrong Way, I will say that was Jeff Lee's idea. He was like, what if you have these enemies coming in at the other, you know, the other planes of the cube? And I was like, are you nuts? Because this was not, we didn't have real collision detection. Any collision detection was sort of kludged. And it was not really a 3D game. I mean, it was a 2D game that just had the illusion of 3D. So I didn't have a clue. I mean, the regular collision detection was challenging enough. But I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I was like, all right, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I figured it out, you know. That was probably the hardest thing I did in the entire game. It was challenging. It was trying to figure out how to get the collision between Ugh and Wrong Way going in the wrong directions to seem like it was fair. All right, here, I'm going to show you something else now. Same looking business card, but you'll notice one little change. The address is different. Summer, 1982, right in the middle of the development of Qbert, management decides, we don't like having these guys off in Bensonville doing their own thing. Let's bring them back into the fold. Let's bring them back to our main plant in North Lake. And that's what they did. So one day, we we're no longer in Bensonville. We just showed up in North Lake, and we had a new area with cubicles now, and it was a much bigger plant, obviously. The thing we didn't know was that all the pinball developers had been kind of pushed off to the side to make room for us, and they were not happy. Now, pinball in general was becoming, you know, looked down upon. When video games started hitting it big, you know, arcades were pushing the pinball games out. Pinball was really suffering a decline, and video games seemed like the coolest thing. So the pinball guys were not thrilled that these video game hotshots were coming in and taking over their place. But we didn't know any of that. We loved pinball. I mean, I think everybody who I worked with in the video department loved pinball. I certainly did, and I thought these pinball designers were gods, you know? So I was very excited to come and meet these guys, and we come in the first day and they're just giving us the stink eye. Which is, you know what I mean? So it worked itself out, but I have to say management did a very bad job of mixing us together. They literally left us on our own. So we had to deal with it ourselves, but we did. We worked it all out, and they were great guys. Here's the only picture I have of me developing Qbert. I didn't take a lot of pictures back then. It just wasn't that interesting to me. But this picture is and it's a terrible picture, I realize that. But this picture is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, this was taken, I'm pretty sure, in the new space, in the North Lake. But one thing you'll see behind me the blue box. This is the IBM development system that we made games on. It took 9-inch square floppy disks. I mean, our game systems had almost no RAM. I mean, we had like 64K of program RAM. I think we had 64K of foreground RAM and 32K for background blocks. So we had not a lot of memory. You can see the screen. You see the screen is upside down, which I believe was because I was working on a cocktail table. We made a Qbert cocktail. When you sit at a cocktail table, it's flat, and the screen switches between players. The other thing that is worthy to note is the little lower left. You will see a joystick, which is actually mounted to the bottom of a plastic bucket, some sort of maybe Tupperware bucket, perhaps. But you'll also see it's turned at a 45-degree angle, which of course makes perfect sense because that's what the pyramid playfield requires. I did not think twice about this. I mean, the joystick was mounted in the direction of the bucket, you know, the dimensions of the bucket, as a normal joystick. I just turned it to a diamond shape because that's what I needed. Well, this threw people off, you know. I mean, one of the things as we were developing games, other people that worked there would come and play your game. That was, you know, you'd want that, and it would just happen. But everybody would come over and they would turn the bucket normal, and then they couldn't play because they'd be pushing in weird directions. So, I don't know why. It was just a really hard concept for people to imagine this thing turn 45 degrees and that you're moving in diagonals. To this day, I don't understand the confusion, but people obviously got used to it eventually. I did have to fight on that, though. Now, the next picture I have is a picture of Jeff Lee, the artist who created the characters. And again, not a photograph, not a photograph. But this is actually, oh, I missed it. But that last picture. Actually, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back. I think we'll do this on its own. No, I'm going the wrong way. Hang on. Hello. Oh, it won't let me go back. There we go. Okay. Too far. Okay, I think this is going to move on its own. I think there's like a video. So this picture was taken. There you go. This was taken from the flyer from Us Versus Them. So I don't know if any of you heard of Us Versus Them. This was the game I did after Qbert. It was a Laserdisc game, and I have to say, I think a much more interesting story than the Qbert story. And I have told this, and I will tell this story again, but not today, unfortunately. This was drawn by a guy named Larry Day, and he just used Jeff Lee as a model. So Jeff got his picture there, but the actual Jeff Lee looks like this. This is Jeff in those days, taken from a video. I actually shot some video in the Gottlieb office. And I don't really show this video very often because it's horribly embarrassing. We all just act like total idiots. So I just don't show it. But this is Jeff, and you'll notice in front of him, there's like pages from a calendar that has sort of Qbert-like stuff, and I'll show you those things later as well. But let's go on to why does Qbert talk the way he does. So the reason Qbert talks the way he does is because of this man, Dave Field. Dave was the sound guy for Qbert, and this picture, by the way, taken at a trade show in the late 80s. Dave was still working in the pinball field today, doing sounds for games to this day. So this is the Gottlieb soundboard. And the yellow arrow up there is pointing to a chip, a very innocuous looking chip, but it's called the Votrax. I don't know if any of you heard of that. But the Votrax was a chip that created speech, English, using phonemes. So, you know, phonemes being like the little elements of sound. Duh, buh, you know, and it would string them together to make words. Now, in the game of Qbert, the only actual English that is spoken is when you power the game on, it says, "Hello, I'm turned on." And after you put your initials in the high score table, it says, "Bye-bye." But to really get it to say anything, I mean, it's horrible, monotone, terrible sounding speech. And Dave had a lot of problem using this. I mean, he was using this in pinball machines at the time as well. And he couldn't get it to say the word bonus, which is, you know, an important word to say. But he would say that every time he tried to get it to say bonus, it sounded like bogus. So he hated this chip. He absolutely hated it. And when he saw the game and he saw Qbert jumping off, and then Jeff had the idea for this cartoon balloon, and he was inspired to say, what if I just threw random numbers at this phoneme generator? And so basically, when Qbert falls off a dice, he's just going random phonemes. So if you think you're hearing actual speech, some people think they hear stuff, it's possible. Because, you know, you string enough random numbers together, you might actually get an English word. But it is not programmed to do that, I'm saying definitively. Now, how did Qbert get his name? So all the time I was working on this game, I didn't call it Qbert. We didn't call it anything. I called it the Cubes game. I just called it Cubes. Actually, here's a picture of code. Here's some of the code. And if you look, you'll see like start player, bye-bye, change square, all very generic names because none of the characters had names. You know, Qbert was player. I think I called Coily Chaser. You'll see something with like CHSR, and that was the character that was chasing him because they didn't have names. Here's I believe this is from, let me see if this is from Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert or not, I can't remember. Probably not, I think this still is from the original Qbert. So this is the start player. The thing is, if you saw the code for Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert, because they all had names, that I started using names in the code. But anyway, so this is an actual page of the listing of the code from one page. It's about this big. It's a huge thing. Anyway, Jeff was the one who I let Jeff name the characters because honestly I had no ideas for him. I had no feeling about naming characters. I was much more interested in the gameplay. So Jeff named Coily the snake. Slick and Sam was supposed to be sort of a riff on Spick and Span, and also we had a programmer named Sam Russo, so Sam's kind of named after him. But when it came to the player character, we really weren't sure what we wanted to call it. Now Howie Rubin, Vice President of Business Development, definitely a man who thinks outside the box, he wanted to call it that. That he wanted the cartoon balloon to be the name of the game. And this is actually a picture of a hand-drawn marquee, which was one of the earliest marquees that had this. And it actually did go out on test with those, and we made a few. This is actually a printed marquee that has this as the name of the game, and I don't know how many of these we made. Nowadays, people make knockoffs so it's hard to know if something's an original one or not. I have one of the original ones in my cabinet at home, but you know, we all told Howie he was insane, because he was. We were like, how are people gonna talk about this game? And Howie would say, you know, if this game is as good as we know it is, they'll find a way. Well, most of us, you know, we're not convinced. So we decided, yes, we need to have a name for the character. We all decided, we all knew just that the name of the game should be the name of the character. By the way, another idea that Howie had for what to call the game, Why Me? He wanted to call the game Why Me? And we were like, no. So we had a meeting, you know. We went into the conference room, 10, 12 of us, you know, the VPs. I was there. Dave Thiel was not there for some reason, but Jeff was there. Rich Tracy, the head of the art department. And we sat and we talked for like 2 hours, just talking about what are we going to name this character. And at one point, I had like an out-of-body experience, and I just was like hovering over the room, looking at everybody, going like, these are grown men talking about what to call this little furry object. And by the way, I kind of skipped over this, but you know, because Jeff had designed the character to shoot out of his nose. That's why he has the long nose. I never wanted to do that. I mean, it just was too complicated to me, and plus, it just didn't fit into the physics. If you're jumping around this pyramid, I don't know, shooting just complicated things in a way that I didn't want to do for my first game. So I just ignored that, but Jeff's idea was, and it was just a joke, but it was to call the game Snots and Boogers. Oh, no. But I have to say, I mean, it has been reported, I've read articles where they've written that that was the original name of the game. No, it was always a joke. It was just a joke. And we've told that joke over the years and people have misinterpreted. But, so that was never in contention as a name. But we're at this meeting, and after, who knows, 2 hours, somebody came up with this and wrote it on the board. Hubert. 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 It's just a silly name. It's like a name. It's a silly name. But then somebody else really had a little stroke of genius, and they erased the H, and they said, well, wait a minute. The game's got cubes in it. What about Qbert? Now we're all starting to go, oh, wait a minute, there's something here. You could feel this like weird energy in the room. And then somebody came and said, wait a minute, no, how about QBERT? And everybody was starting to froth at the mouths because this is, and then Jeff Lee goes, I mean, he puts the asterisks in, and we're like, yes, that's it. Right, maybe it wasn't that dramatic, but it really, it was kind of like that. We all, because literally after, you know, hours of talking about this, we didn't know what, and it all just sort of congealed and everybody was in agreement. So that's how Qbert got his name. The knocker. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the knocker feature, that when Qbert falls and hits the bottom of the cabinet, you hear a loud knock. Yeah. Well, that knocker was the idea of a guy named Rick Ty. He was one of our engineering techs. You know, so he was playing the game and he was like, okay, wait a minute, you jump off, what if there's a pinball knocker at the bottom? Well, I said, you know, listen, that's a great idea, but I would prefer it, I mean, a knock is the wrong sound. We really want a thud. Like it's like a sack of potatoes kind of a sound. So, this, by the way, is the actual device. This is what the pinball knockers look like, and there's a little piston, and you know, it would get a little electrical jolt, and it would shove out, and it would knock the side of the cabinet. But again, knocking was the wrong sound. So we put a little piece of foam rubber, right where the piston hits the cabinet, and it was perfect. It was like, oh my God. It just sounded like a thud. So I was very jazzed, very excited about it. Well, we told management, it was like, this is what we want to do. They're like, no, can't do it. It's too labor intensive. Somehow, adding this piece of foam, somebody would have to go in there and position it, and it would cost an extra $15 a cabinet or whatever. And they said no, they nixed it. So the knocker went in anyway, and it is a cool feature. A lot of people like it, I like it, but unfortunately I know how much better it could have been. And if any of you have Qbert cabinets, I highly recommend you go and put a piece of foam, you get a much better sound. Testing and tuning. Well, okay, so the game started to be finished, and really it was like the next thing was play testing. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never made a video game before, so I didn't know exactly how to test. I know what the goal of testing was. Oh, and let's see. Okay, so there's three ways of testing, right? You've got in-house testing, which is where people come and play your game in-house, as I mentioned before, and that was very helpful. Of course, most of the feedback I got was that it was too hard. And so, you know, because people would just jump right off the pyramid. They'd push the joystick, jump right off the pyramid. But I kind of was like, but you know, you got to learn that. Once you learn that, you know, it's got to be challenging or it's not really fun. And you know, people thought it was too fast and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the second type of testing was location testing in arcades. So we would take test cabinets, put them in an actual arcade, and we would just watch people play. And also, the arcade owners would collect the money from the coin box, and then we'd get a sense of, are people interested in playing this game? Because we were manufacturers, okay? We built the games. We made our money off of building these cabinets. The operators made money off the coin box. But obviously, if we had bad test results, if people aren't putting money in the coin box, then nobody wants to buy it, and then we can't build as many. So it was an interesting dynamic, the way this coin-out market worked. We put this out in a local arcade, and I would go there, and I would watch people play. And I remember there was this time this little girl walked up to the cabinet, she puts in her quarter, pushes the stick, falls off. Gets her next life, pushes the stick, falls off. 3 times in a row, she dies, game's over. I'm thinking, I'm in trouble. I am not gonna, I don't know how to fix this. And she walks away. But she came back. And she tried it again. And then she came back again and watched somebody else play. And she kept doing it. And she kept putting money in. And other people did the same thing. And so that was when I was realizing, okay, yes, there's a learning curve, but, and the thing about arcades is it was a social environment. So people would watch other people play, and that was an important part of the process. So I did feel good about that. And then the third way of testing were focus groups. And Gottlieb actually did this. They would hire a focus group company, or they'd hire an office or something with a mirror that was glass on the other side, and I was sitting in the other room watching people. And this was hysterical, because I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to be on the other side of that mirror in a focus group, but you know, people, first you let them play the game, and you're watching them play the game, and they're having so much fun, and then then you ask them about it, and they're like, yeah, it was all right. So I learned a lot about judging people. You know, a lot of people just, I don't know what it is about human nature, but I did get feedback again. You know, people wanted it easier. People didn't get into it, and so I kept tuning it easier, making it easier. I was feeling a little bad about it, but again, I was inexperienced and I wanted to please people. So, by the way, this for our techies over here, the QBERT hardware, we had an 8088 CPU. Our sprites in the foreground was 16. Actually, that's incorrect. I think they were. No, I am correct. I'm sorry. 16 by 16 were the sprites. Coily was a double sprite, so he was 32 by 16. The background blocks were 8 by 8. Program memory 64 kilobytes, and the screen resolution 256 by 240. That's what we had. That's what we had to work with. The 16 colors. It was a palette-based system. You had a total of 16 colors for the game, and this was we had the same hardware for all of the Gottlieb games, even the Laserdisc games. When we came out with Mach 3 and Us versus Them, all they did is replace the background plane with the Laserdisc footage, but it had the same foreground plane.
Any idea why you guys went with Intel instead of like Z80? A lot of the games were Z80 at the time.
I do not. Jun Yum was the hardware designer. He did the system. It was a great system to work on, I have to say. I didn't mind programming 8088. It was fine by me. And the hardware did a lot. I mean, all we had to do was give a sprite number and an X and Y location, and the hardware put it there. So we didn't have to do blitting or anything like that. Like Williams systems, always you had to paint the screen from top to bottom. But with the background blocks and foreground sprites, man, it was a very easy system to program on. All right, so fall of 1982, up thereabouts. QBERT's ready to go public. Here's a picture of the assembly line. I mean, I can't tell you what it was like to see all of these QBERTs running off of the assembly line. I mean, management was happy too, because Reactor, the game that was produced before Reactor, was a bit of a disappointment. It did not sell as well as they'd hoped. They didn't build as many as they'd hoped. Nowadays, I think people generally like the game. You know, it's considered a little bit of a breakthrough of a game. It was different. Tim Skelly, again, a guy who thinks out of the box, but they were looking for a hit, and Q*bert turned out to be that hit. So the first trade show where Q*bert was seen was the AMOA of November of 1982. I know it's a terrible picture, but you know, Q*bert balloons. There's a big Q*bert thing there. Gottlieb had a nice thing. They had a bunch of Q*berts there, and then this is from December of 1982. This is a trade magazine. I think Replay. I believe this is a Replay magazine. And here's a little blow up of a picture in the middle there. I'm all the way on the right. Jun Yum, the hardware designer, is on the left. Howie is standing next to me, and Boyd Brown, the president of Gottlieb, is standing up there. And this caption is wrong. It's just, the press gets things wrong all the time. So it says Gottlieb's new Q*bert game is the center attraction as designer Jun Yum, well, he was the hardware designer, not the game designer, Gottlieb president Boyd Brown, and programmers Warren Davis and Howard Rubin. Howie was the furthest thing from a programmer. He was the VP of Business Development. So, but anyway, there you go. That's the press, and it got more good press. Here's a thing calling it the Showstopper. Let's see, I'm not sure exactly what magazine this is. This is from Playmeter. Playmeter, this is 1/15/83. You know, it's at the top of everybody's list. So yeah, Q*bert was a hit from the get-go. And that was good for management. They were very happy. That was good for me personally. You know, I was basically given carte blanche to do whatever I wanted after that. But one thing I did not want was to do another Q*bert game. I just felt like I did this, and it was great. But I was just starting my video game career, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life continuing to make Q*bert games. So I was happy to move on. But I couldn't move on just yet. Because as great as the game was, I kind of felt like it was too easy. And when it was released and it was going out in the field, within about 3 weeks, we were hearing about people playing for hours on one quarter. So now I'm going like, ah, damn it. You know, it seemed like maybe I went too far in correcting, you know, the problems that people were having. So for me, the problems were that it was too slow, it was too easy, and it was not challenging enough. Now, for some people, they loved it, but you know, again, you know, if people can play it that far, you don't want. We're a coin-op company. We're based on quarters. The design of a coin-op game is how many quarters can you get people to put in the machine, and I don't mean that in a capitalistic way. We wanted people to have fun. I wanted people to enjoy the game, but you know, that was just a reality. Is that your game wouldn't be a success if people wouldn't put quarters in. So there was this sort of like sweet spot where you'd want some people to be able to achieve, but you didn't want too many people. Anyway, I doubted my tuning, and so I decided I'm going to make a new version of Q*bert. I'm going to continue to work on it. And the way I solved all these problems is I made it faster, I made it harder, and I made it more challenging. So I had this new version of Q*bert that I did, and I called it Faster, Harder, More Challenging Q*bert. Because I didn't want to call it Super Q*bert or Q*bert 2, but I did this, and I literally did this just as the original Q*bert was still rolling off the production line, is when I was working on this. And I did it with Jeff. Dave really wasn't involved. There were no new sounds, but there was a new character called Q*bertha, who looked like a female Q*bert, and she took the place of Coily in later rounds. There was a bonus round where you had millions of Slicks and Sams falling all at once. It was pretty interesting. Anyway, something else happened, by the way, that was sort of in the middle of us. You'll notice in the copyright notice, it does not say Gottlieb. It says Milestar Electronics. And that's because right around this time, for some reason that I don't even know, Gottlieb decided they wanted to change their name. Maybe this was Coca-Cola's influence, I don't know why. But they decided to change their names to Milestar Electronics. And they had a meeting where everybody from the company came, and they had a board, a big cardboard thing with a sheet over it, and we didn't know what it was all about. And the president of the company, Boyd Brown, was there, and he pulls this thing down. We're now called Milestar Electronics. And the first thing I said was, Does anybody know that that's rat slime spelled backwards? That's what I noticed. And I said it out loud, and everybody laughed, except Boyd Brown, president of the company. He was not happy. They were stuck with the name. I don't know how they came up with it. Pinball games, for historical reasons, I guess, still said Gottlieb, but all the video games after that were called Milestone. This is a little bit of faster, harder, more challenging Qbert. So one thing you notice is the discs move. They're not static. Slick and Sam create a pattern that Qbert cannot change back. You need to, that's Qbertha. So you need to lead Qbertha over these patterns to change them back. So there's a whole bunch of new elements. The way the levels were structured was slightly differently. It got harder, faster. I loved this version. This is my Qbert of choice. I had it in my own Qbert cabinet at home for 20 years, or 15 years rather, and Gottlieb would not release it, or Milestone. They just felt it was too soon, it was too close to the original Qbert, they did not release it, and so it sat in my cabinet. And in 1997, I happened to work at Disney, and I knew a guy named Fred Suzukian, and he knew guys who were working on this project where they were emulating old arcade systems for the PC. Well, one of those systems was Qbert, and this is just a ROM change. So I said, you know, if you want, I'll give you the ROM images. And lo and behold, in 1997, Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert was released to MAME. And it's been in MAME ever since. You can play this game now. A lot of people burn the ROMs and put them in their Qbert cabinets. Again, I make no money off of any of this, but I'm happy. This, by the way, is a picture. Another thing we added, there was an animation where Qbert spins around this thing, his nose extends, and he drinks out of this cup. This was actually repurposed. We were asked to do a special mellow yellow version of Qbert. And so we did this special version, and that was, there was a contest where somebody actually got that. All right, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to try and go through this very, very quickly, but the Qbert calendar and coloring book is just something one of our artists, Chris Brewer, did. He did an entire calendar with all this art, very cool stuff. He also did a coloring book. This is called the Qbert Coloring Book. It's all based off of the Q puns, Julius Caesar, Qbeard the Pirate. Again, this was a whole booklet. Management jumped on this pun thing as well. This is a Qbert flyer. Qbert's collects quarters. And then, again, I'm running out of time, so I'll just go this very quickly. But the aftermath of Qbert articles. This is an article in USA Today, which floored me. April 1983. Qbert was talked about in USA Today. Many magazine covers, a lot of coverage for Qbert. John Mellencamp sitting here leaning on a Qbert in the magazine Vidiot. It's a Japanese flyer. Video Games Magazine. There was a very long article in Video Games Magazine about American-made games. And the thing that's interesting about this is that we were not allowed to use our names. Gottlieb did not want us to use our names. So I was called Designer. Jeff was called Artiste. And Dave was called J. Walkman. But in the same article, William, they also talked about Joust. And John Newcomer, who designed Joust, he was mentioned by name without any problem. It's just Gottlieb was very worried about poaching, where other companies would come and steal their developers away. But after this article, they got they got a lot of flack. They got a lot of backlash. And then so when I made FHMC Qbert, I was actually able to put in a credits page, and there it is. So this is the New Yorker. The New Yorker is talking about Qbert. So it was very mind-blowing for me. This one, August of 1983, from Glamour. Glamour magazine is talking about Qbert. Here's the High C contest. There's a Qbert contest. This is, again, a brochure, 125 products. It was amazing. Qbert was licensed to everything. I did not get any of this stuff. I had to buy it myself if I wanted. Here's the Mellow Yellow contest. You get your own, you literally got your own arcade. Consumer Electronics Show, where all the home games were introduced. Sorry to be going through this so fast. Qbert's Cubes. So I mentioned Qbert's Cubes earlier. Neil Bernstein a junior programmer, he asked me, he said, I have an idea for a Qbert game, do you mind if I do it? And I said, nope, go, have it, I'm done with Qbert. And he did this. I'm not a fan of the game myself, but you know, it was released, it is a playable. Qbert's Quest, as I said, and then Milestar closed their doors in 1984 because I think Coca-Cola did not want them. Anyway, this is from last year at the Pinball Expo in Wheeling. Was the first time the three of us have been together in about 30 years. I mean, I've seen Jeff over the years, and I've seen Dave independently, and I think Jeff and Dave have seen each other, but the three of us were not together until then, and there we are, a bunch of old guys. By the way, this one, I want to leave you with this image. I just found this on the internet, but apparently, if you want to, you can buy this. You can buy a Qbert outfit. The reason I love this picture so much is because look at the look on this guy's face. It's like, you know, can I have my 20 bucks? Can I don't know. It's just... Anyway, thank you guys. I do appreciate you being here and listening to my old memories. And again, I'm out of time, but if you want to track me down later in the show and ask me any questions, I'm happy to do that. Thanks again.